Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. Before we get going into today's episode, if you could just hit subscribe from wherever you're listening. If you aren't following, go ahead and click the bell. Make sure you follow so that you receive notifications for all new content. And while you're at it, leave a review or drop a comment. One of the requests that I received recently was to do an episode on narcissistic neglect. And one thing I want to say up front is I think there's a lot of great podcasts and books and YouTube videos explaining narcissistic traits or helping you decide whether someone in your life is a narcissist. So that's not necessarily what I want to do in this episode. What interests me more is something that I rarely hear talked about in the books, in the pod, and the YouTube videos. What is it like to grow up in an environment where your emotional development is organized around a parent's narcissism? Not just what it feels like as a child, but how it shapes your identity, your relationships, your marriage, and your ability to trust yourself. And even your ability to answer what sounds like a very simple question. One of the things that I've noticed over years of working with adults who grew up with narcissistic neglect is that they don't just struggle with boundaries. Many of them struggle with knowing themselves. And I think that's one of the deepest injuries narcissistic neglect leaves behind. So today I want to focus less on diagnosing parents and more on understanding what this kind of childhood does to a developing child, and more importantly, how we begin to heal from it. What is narcissistic neglect? When I use the phrase narcissistic neglect, I'm not talking about a parent who occasionally makes mistakes. Every parent misses things. Every parent gets tired. Every parent has moments when they're emotionally unavailable. That's part of being human. Narcissistic neglect is something different. It's what happens when a parent's need to protect their own identity, emotions, image, and self-worth consistently takes precedence over understanding and responding to the child's emotional experience. When the parent's emotional world is so centered on themselves that there isn't enough space left to truly know their child or to help that child develop into a separate person, that's narcissistic neglect. Healthy parenting isn't about creating children in your image. It's about creating the conditions where your child gradually over time becomes more themselves. They develop their own interests, their own opinions, their own preferences, their own values, and their own way of seeing the world. That's actually the developmental task of childhood. And here's what's important. Children don't discover who they are in isolation. They discover who they are in relationship. A child isn't born knowing what they enjoy or what they're good at or how they feel. They discover those things because someone is curious enough to notice them. Someone asks them questions and reflects back. A parent may say, "You seem really excited about that," or "You really enjoy building things. That sounds like it really hurt your feelings." Or a simple, "Tell me more," or "What do you think?" Thousands of those small moments help a child become known, not just to their parent, but more importantly, to themselves. And that's one of the reasons narcissistic neglect can be so confusing. People often think that neglect means a child wasn't fed or was constantly left alone. Sometimes that's true, but many of the clients that I've worked with had food, they went to school, they had birthdays, they participated in sports or other extracurricular activities. From the outside, their childhood looked pretty normal. In fact, some of the most confusing cases involve families that appeared unusually close, where the parent was very involved, always there. But presence and attunement aren't the same thing. A parent can be deeply involved in a child's life while still not being genuinely curious about who that child actually is. Their involvement becomes their own image as a devoted parent, or the parent's need to be needed, or the parent's desire to shape the child into a particular reflection of themselves. It can look like closeness, but underneath, the child's actual self, their present, their preferences, their inner world, and their separate identity remains largely unexplored. I also think there's an issue around narcissistic neglect that often goes unaddressed. Narcissistic neglect from mothers or from whoever served as the primary caretaker is at least as common as it is from fathers, but it's often harder to recognize. Most of what gets written about narcissistic parents tends to focus on the more visible, grandiose version of narcissism. But female narcissism frequently presents differently. It's less likely to look loud or dominant. It's more likely to look like martyrdom, emotional enmeshment, covert victimhood, or an almost suffocating devotion. A narcissistic mother can be extremely present, involved in every detail of her children's lives, while still making the relationship fundamentally about herself. Because of that, narcissistic neglect from a mother is especially easy to miss, both from the outside and from the inside. Society holds mothers to a particular standard of selflessness and devotion, which means narcissistic behavior in mothers is easier to explain away. And when a mother was clearly involved, was clearly there, it can feel almost disloyal to name what was missing. If you grew up with a mother like this, you may have spent years telling yourself that she meant well. She tried hard. She loved you. All of that can be true and still leave you with very little room to become your own person. A mother can be devoted and present and still make very little space for her child's separate self. Those things are not contradictory. The primary caretaker relationship also carries particular developmental weight, regardless of gender. That's the relationship where a child's earliest and deepest sense of self first forms. When that relationship is organized around the caretaker's psychological needs, rather than the child's growth, the impact reaches into the foundation of who that child learns to be. In all of these situations, something essential wasn't happening. The child's inner world wasn't being developed. It wasn't being explored, and it wasn't being reflected back to them. The deepest injury of narcissistic neglect isn't simply that your needs weren't met. It's that your developing self was never consistently experienced as worthy of another person's genuine curiosity, care, and emotional investment. Before we go any further, I do want to make an important distinction between a narcissistic parent and an emotionally immature parent. Every narcissistic parent is emotionally immature. But not every emotionally immature parent is narcissistic. And that can be a distinction that a lot of people miss. Emotional immaturity exists on a spectrum. Some parents grew up in homes where emotions weren't talked about. Some may have never learned to regulate themselves. Some avoid conflict because conflict felt dangerous in their own childhood. Some became overwhelmed by their parents' emotions because no one ever helped them understand their own. And some invalidate, dismiss, or minimize, not because they're intentionally trying to hurt their children, but because they simply don't have the emotional capacity they needed. Those parents, emotionally immature parents, can absolutely create attachment wounds. They can leave children feeling lonely, misunderstood, unseen, and emotionally unsupported. The wounds they leave are real and they matter. But what I've noticed in working with clients who grew up with a narcissistic parent is that something more seems to be happening. It's not simply that the parent lacks emotional skills. It's that the relationship itself becomes organized around the parent's psychological needs. In healthy development, a parent's role is to gradually help a child become more fully themselves. In narcissistic parenting, the child's development becomes secondary to protecting the parent's emotional world. The child's job becomes maintaining the relationship, protecting the parent's image, regulating the parent's emotions, and reinforcing the parent's narcissistic identity. The child begins adapting to what their parent needs rather than discovering who they are. The key distinction between both of these types of parents isn't whether mistakes were made. Emotionally immature parents make plenty of mistakes, and those hurt. The difference is what organizes the relationship. Is it ultimately organized around helping the child become themselves, even imperfectly and inconsistently? Or is it organized around protecting the parent's identity and their sense of self, which can be fragile? And that's a significant distinction because the developmental task of childhood is becoming yourself. But if your energy is consistently spent becoming who someone else needs you to be, there isn't a lot of room to discover who you are. One framework that's helped me make sense of narcissistic family systems is thinking about the different roles people tend to occupy in a narcissist world. I'll often say narcissists don't see people as separate individuals with their own lives, views, and purposes. Instead, people tend to fall into one of a few categories. The first group is made up of people whose role is to reinforce and uphold the narcissist's identity and image. This is often spouses, children, close friends, and maybe employees. People whose job, whether anyone says it out loud or not, is to reflect back that this person is wonderful, successful, they're right, and they're special. As long as those people continue serving that role for the narcissist, the relationship often feels relatively stable. The second group consists of people the narcissist wants to impress. These are often people with influence, status, or authority. Relationships here are organized around image. The narcissist wants to look successful, look important, and look exceptional. And they use the people in the first group in order to do that. The third group of people is perhaps most revealing. These are the people who begin seeing behind this narcissistic image. They might ask difficult questions, or they notice inconsistencies. They start to set limits and boundaries. And they stop reinforcing the identity the narcissist has constructed. These people often become a threat. Not because they're literally dangerous, but because they threaten the narcissist's psychological stability. That's often when we see blame, rewriting of history, triangulation, and the narcissist attempts to discredit them. What's heartbreaking is that children often move through these categories as they grow. A young child naturally admires their parents. They depend on them, and they want their parents' approval, which places them firmly in that first group. And often in the second group, where the narcissist is able to use their children to try to impress others. But healthy development requires children to gradually become separate people. They begin having different opinions, different interests, different values. They say no. They question. They might remember things differently. And they start to establish boundaries. In healthy families, that's expected. There's permission for that. And it's seen as development. But in a narcissistic family system, that growing independence can feel like rejection or betrayal for the narcissist. The very thing that represents healthy development for the child is experienced as a threat to the narcissistic parent. One of the best ways to understand narcissistic neglect isn't through a clinical definition. I think it's through stories. And I'm going to use a few stories from raising my own daughters because ordinary moments of healthy parenting reveal, by contrast, what gets missed in homes with narcissistic neglect. One of my parenting memories involves my third daughter when she was about 4 years old. Around October, she started asking me to make ladybug food. Every so often, she'd bring it up and she'd remind me, "Mom, you still haven't made ladybug food for dinner." I had absolutely no idea what ladybug food was. So at Thanksgiving time, I'm making the meal for Thanksgiving, and I have different herbs to season the turkey. And I asked her, "Do you mean like this, like an herb?" And she said, "No," with a perplexed look on her face. A few months later, when she brought it up again, I said, "Do you mean grass?" She looked at me like I had completely missed the point. And she said, "I don't eat grass." For months, every once in a while, she'd bring it up. "Mom, you still haven't made ladybug food." I still had no idea what she was referring to. And then summer came. I bought a watermelon and I cut it up for dinner. And the minute she came in and saw it, her face lit up. She said, "Mom, this is ladybug food." And immediately I understood. Of course, watermelon is red with black seeds. In the imaginative mind of a 3 turning 4-year-old, it looked exactly like a ladybug. What I see when I look back at that memory isn't that I eventually figured it out. It's that for months, I stayed curious. She kept bringing it up, and I kept asking questions. I didn't tell her she was wrong. I didn't tell her I had never intentionally made ladybug food. And then eventually, when I finally got it right, I didn't correct her vocabulary. I didn't tell her this is not ladybug food. This is called a watermelon. I accepted that there was something happening inside her little mind that made perfect sense to her, even though I couldn't see it yet. I think that's a gift that parents give a child: sustained curiosity. It's not perfect parenting, but it's staying curious. Curiosity says there's something inside you worth discovering. It tells kids that their thoughts matter, their imagination matters, and their experience matters. Think about what happens when a child experiences thousands of moments like that. They begin to internalize something. They begin to internalize a belief that says, my inner world makes sense. It's valuable. There's a reason I feel what I feel, and I'm worth getting to know. That's how a sense of self begins to develop. Now think about the opposite. Imagine a child whose inner world is rarely explored, whose questions are dismissed, whose imagination is corrected instead of understood, whose parent assumes they already know what the child is thinking rather than becoming curious. The message they receive isn't just, don't call that ladybug food, but the deeper message becomes, your inner world isn't very interesting. Or your inner world is wrong. Or my version of reality matters more than yours. Often we tend to think that attachment is built in the big moments: birthdays, family vacations, comforting a child when they're hurt or had a bad dream. Those moments matter, but attachment is also built in these small, seemingly insignificant, everyday interactions where a parent communicates, I'm interested in your mind. I want to understand how you see the world. And that's exactly where narcissistic neglect leaves one of its marks. Not necessarily through one traumatic event, but through the absence of thousands of these quiet, mind, soul-building moments. One of the things I've come to appreciate is that healthy parenting is not about having all the answers. And it's not about making sure your child always agrees with you. It's about helping a child develop their own mind, their own ability to wonder, to ask questions, to make meaning out of their experiences, and to trust their perceptions. That's very different from teaching a child what to think. Instead, you're teaching them how to think, and you're showing interest in how they do that. In our family, when our kids were growing up, a lot of that happened around the dinner table. As you probably know, we had 4 daughters, and during the week, we'd usually sit down together for dinner. Sometimes the kids talked about school updates. Sometimes it was friend drama. Sometimes one of the girls would be upset because someone had hurt their feelings. Jeff and I didn't always jump in and solve the problem or tell them the right thing to do. Instead, we'd often ask questions. Questions like, why do you think she did that? Or, oh, I wonder what was going on for him. Or, how do you think your friend felt? Or, what do you think would happen if you fill in the blank? Or sometimes just, what do you think you're going to do about that? I remember one dinner when our two oldest were in high school. There had been a news story. I don't recall the exact details. I think it involved a homicide investigation where police had recovered someone's phone. And there was a debate about whether Apple should help the police unlock it because it had a security code to get into the phone. It raised interesting questions about privacy, about public safety, and technology. Now, what I remember about that dinner time conversation isn't what any of us concluded. I don't really even recall the different points that were made. But I do remember sitting around the table asking my kids, what do you think? One of the girls would make a point. One of the other ones might disagree or see it from a different angle. Jeff or I would ask a question. Someone might see a different side of it. Sometimes Jeff and I would say, that's a really good point. Or, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. Genuinely saying those things. We weren't trying to convince our daughters to think a certain thing. Jeff and I hadn't really concluded what should happen. But we were just trying to help them become people who could think. And they were learning my mind matters. My ideas matter. Sometimes they would take one side and then 5 minutes later, they're arguing the other side. So they also learned that they could change their mind and that their perspective was worth hearing, even if somebody else disagreed. I've worked with a number of adults who tell me that was not their experience growing up. In fact, one of the things I hear surprisingly often is, I wasn't allowed to ask questions. At first, I thought maybe their parents felt they were being disrespectful. But that's not really what they were describing. They were describing growing up confused, whether that was about why the family did things the way they did, or confused about why rules seemed to change, confused about expectations or routines. And when they asked, they were shut down. The parent said, because I said so. Or for some of my clients, the parent acted as if they hadn't even heard the question when the kid was standing right next to them. Or the parent became angry. And after a while, children will stop asking. Curiosity for them doesn't magically just appear in adulthood. It's either welcomed or discouraged throughout childhood. Every time a parent responds with, tell me more, curiosity starts to grow. Every time a child learns that asking questions creates danger, curiosity shrinks a little bit more. So here's the question I often keep coming back to. If children don't develop a sense of self in isolation, and they aren't given the relational environment where that self can naturally emerge, what develops instead? I don't think the answer is nothing. I think something always develops. But the question is what it's organized around. I don't think children raised with narcissistic neglect become empty. I've found they become incredibly adaptive. Instead of developing an identity organized around who they are, they develop an identity organized around maintaining connection. If healthy development sounds like, what do I like? What do I enjoy? What kind of person am I? What matters to me? If you were a child growing up with a narcissistic parent with narcissistic neglect, those questions often get replaced by what keeps mom happy? What keeps dad from getting upset? How do I avoid criticism? And who do I need to become to belong in this family? But that's not an identity that develops. That's adaptation. One of the most specific adaptations I see is hypervigilance. Many adults who grew up with narcissistic neglect become remarkably skilled at reading other people. They can sense a shift in someone's mood before that person has consciously registered it themselves. They walk into a room and immediately take stock of the emotional temperature. They can anticipate needs before anyone asks. And from the outside, this often looks like exceptional empathy. And in some ways, it is. But it developed as a survival skill. Learning to read the environment carefully enough to stay safe, to avoid triggering a parent's volatility, to know when to disappear and when to perform. In adulthood, that same skill becomes exhausting. You're constantly scanning, managing everyone around you, and there's very little room left to simply be present. Another thing I've noticed is that many adults who grew up with narcissistic neglect don't trust their own needs. They don't trust their perceptions or their opinions. They don't trust their feelings. Sometimes a client will tell me a story about something as simple as buying a different kind of cookie than they normally would. That's a very powerful moment for them because they realize there isn't a right kind of cookie. They can actually decide, what kind of cookie do I want right now? And that's not because they're indecisive. It's because nobody spent years helping them become curious about themselves or giving them permission to be who they are and for that to change in different moments. I sometimes think children growing up with narcissistic neglect become experts on everyone else while remaining strangers to themselves. I've also noticed that for some of these clients, they have a very strong sense of their family's identity. They can tell me, for example, we're the Joneses, and they have real pride, a sense of being part of something exceptional. But when I ask, who are you within that family, they tend to get quiet. Healthy families help children develop an identity within the family, while families organized around narcissism often expect children to preserve the family's identity. The family narrative becomes more important than the individual child's development. So the child's job isn't discovering themselves, it's maintaining and being part of this family identity. I've worked with clients who grew up in this superior family, only casually to reveal in therapy stories of significant neglect. I remember one client who described being the kid at school with poor hygiene. Other kids noticed, as they do. He was embarrassed, but no adult stepped in to help him. And it wasn't because of a lack of money. It wasn't that they couldn't provide for his needs, but they didn't. And I'm not even sure they noticed. One of the things children naturally do is normalize the environment they grow up in. It's all they've ever known, which means a lot of adults come into therapy genuinely convinced they had a wonderful childhood. They're telling the story the family told about itself. And sometimes one of the first tasks in therapy is gently helping someone separate this family story from the story of what it was actually like to be a child in that family. Those aren't always the same story. One of the things that makes this particularly hard is that many survivors spend years wondering whether their experience was even bad enough to name. There might not be any visible abuse, no obvious crisis. It can feel almost dishonest to call something neglect. One of the things I hear is, my parents did the best they could, or other people had it so much worse. I don't want to blame them for everything. And those things may all be true. And the impact on your development can still be very real. Minimizing your experience and struggles is often itself a symptom of narcissistic neglect. If your perceptions were constantly dismissed, you learn to dismiss them yourself. Learning to trust that something mattered, even when it's hard to name, is part of healing. And that developmental interruption doesn't stay in childhood. We carry it into our adult relationships, friendships, marriages, parenting, and work. It can show up as difficulty receiving care, feeling uncomfortable or even suspicious when someone is genuinely kind without needing anything in return. It shows up as overfunctioning, working harder than anyone else in the relationship to make sure everything is okay, that no one is upset and there's no conflict. It shows up in gravitating toward familiar dynamics, unconsciously finding yourself in relationships that feel comfortable precisely because they mirror what you grew up in. And it shows up in feeling most at ease when you're needed, because being needed was the clearest way you knew to belong. That naturally raises another question for a lot of the clients I work with. If this is the relational environment a child grows up in, does that mean they automatically become narcissistic themselves? I don't think the answer is that simple. One of the fears I hear most often from clients who grew up with a narcissistic parent is, what if I'm just like my mom? Or what if I'm becoming my dad? It's an understandable fear, because the first people we learn relationships from are our parents. Long before children can evaluate whether something is healthy or unhealthy, functional or dysfunctional, they're watching, absorbing, learning how people handle conflict, how people apologize or don't, and what happens when someone gets hurt. Children aren't usually thinking, my parent has narcissistic traits. They think, this must be how relationships work. That's why I often tell clients, You can't inherit a personality disorder, but you do inherit a relational model. You may have learned to become defensive. You may have learned to avoid accountability because accountability in your family wasn't safe. You may have learned to focus on yourself as an adult because no one modeled mutuality. And you may have learned that whoever is loudest or the most upset determines the emotional climate. Those are all learned relational strategies, and they made sense in the environment you grew up in. Now, I do think there are some family systems where a child is actively shaped to adopt the parent's way of relating to the world, particularly when there's a golden child dynamic. That child may be idolized, protected from accountability, and rewarded for seeing the world through the parent's eyes. In those situations, the child may carry more narcissistic patterns into adulthood, not because they were born that way, but because those patterns were consistently modeled and reinforced. That doesn't happen in every narcissistic family. And siblings in the same home often adapt in completely different ways. One child can become the caretaker, another the perfectionist, and another is the invisible child. One child might identify strongly with the narcissistic parent. Children adapt to the role that helps them maintain connection in the family they're in. I've worked with women who grew up with narcissistic mothers and then became mothers themselves. They desperately wanted to parent differently. They want their children to come home to them with feelings. They want openness, closeness, and emotional availability. But then their 5-year-old has a complete meltdown. Their 10-year-old wants their full attention when they're completely exhausted. Or their teenager says, "You don't understand me." Suddenly they feel irritated, overwhelmed, or even angry. And they think, "What is wrong with me? I wanted to be a different kind of mother." Often what's happening isn't that they're narcissistic. Their child's healthy dependency is activating needs that were never met for them. Their nervous system doesn't have much experience receiving those kinds of needs with calm because no one consistently responded that way to them. Her child says, "Mom, will you come play with me?" And she feels immediate irritation. Not because she doesn't love her child, but because her nervous system hears, "Someone needs something from me again." She might snap and then feel guilty and then overcompensate. But that's a very different cycle than a narcissistic parent who feels entitled to prioritize themselves. Her child might ask why repeatedly. And instead of curiosity, she feels her body tighten. And she hears herself say, "Because I said so." And then later, maybe in a session, she'll say, "I hated hearing that growing up. Why did I say that?" It's a learned relational response. It's not their identity. And they can talk about the fact that that's not what they wanted to do. Her child expressed disappointment. And instead of simply staying with the feeling, she floods with shame and starts explaining herself, defending herself, trying to convince her child she's not a bad mom. The conversation subtly shifts from "my child is disappointed" to "please don't think I'm a bad mother." Again, that's not necessarily narcissism, but it is unresolved attachment. I think the most important distinction for moms is that a mother repeating learned patterns often says afterward, I don't like how I responded. I wonder why I got so activated. I need to repair that. Whereas a narcissistic parent remains focused on protecting their identity. So they project that their child's being too sensitive. They can even defend themselves saying, I did nothing wrong. Why are you making me the bad guy? Or this common phrase, after everything I do for you. The difference isn't whether the mom had an activated moment. The difference is what happens after the activation. Healthy children are going to ask healthy things of their parents. They ask for attention. They need a lot of attention. They ask why over and over again. They interrupt. They need help regulating. They need repair. And if those normal developmental needs consistently activate a parent's own unresolved wounds, the parent may react from those wounds rather than respond to the child in front of them. That doesn't mean they're narcissistic. It means their own development still needs attention. The more interesting question isn't, did you learn the model? Of course you did. That's what children do. The more important question is, what happens when you become aware of it? Before we talk about healing, I want to talk about something that often gets skipped. This work involves grief, real grief. Not just grief for specific painful memories, although those happen, but grief for the parent you needed and didn't have. Grief for the childhood that looked okay from the outside. Grief for the version of yourself that might have emerged if those thousands of curious, attuned moments had happened. Grief for the questions that were never asked, the interests that were never noticed, and the parts of you that went unexplored for years. That grief is legitimate. And in my experience, it's often one of the most important parts of healing. Because you can't fully move forward from something you haven't allowed yourself to see and mourn. One of the things that makes this grief complicated is that it often doesn't feel like grief. It feels like anger or numbness or a vague sense that something is missing that you can't quite name. And because the loss isn't something that happened on a specific day, it's something that never happened across thousands of ordinary moments, it can be hard to recognize as loss at all. But it is a loss. Often clients will just describe a feeling, not a particular memory, but just a feeling that was consistently there. And giving yourself permission to grieve it rather than minimize it or explain it away is often where healing actually begins. One of the things that often comes up in therapy, especially once someone begins to understand what happened in their childhood, is the impulse to go back to the parent and talk about it, to have a conversation, to tell them what it felt like, what was missing, what they needed. And the hope is that being finally seen by the person who didn't see you might provide some of the repair that never happened. So let me say this gently, because I don't want to take away hope unnecessarily. But those conversations are rarely successful. And understanding why can save a lot of pain. With a narcissistic parent, the obstacle is structural. Acknowledging that they caused harm would require tolerating a version of themselves that threatens their narcissistic image. So the conversation almost always gets redirected. They become the victim. They remind you of everything they sacrificed. They point to how ungrateful you seem. They minimize what you experienced, or they rewrite the history entirely. Or sometimes they'll talk about how hard it was for them. The child, who's now an adult, leaves the conversation not only without repair, but often with an additional wound. With emotionally immature parents, the outcome is often similar, though for different reasons. It's not necessarily that the parents aren't willing. Many genuinely want a better relationship. But these conversations require the very capacity they've always lacked: the ability to sit with someone else's pain without making it about themselves, without defending, and without shutting down. Even the most well-intentioned, emotionally immature parent often can't hold what you're bringing them. That doesn't mean the relationship has to end, but it often means that the repair you're looking for is unlikely to come from the source of the wound. And one of the most painful pieces of grief work is letting go of that hope. Not because you don't deserve it, but because they may simply not be capable of providing it. The acknowledgement you needed and still need is something you'll have to find through other relationships, through therapy, and through gradually learning to offer it to yourself. One of the things I find most hopeful in this work is that learning a relational model isn't the same as being locked into it. We all learn relationships somewhere. The first relationship you experienced wasn't one you chose. It was one you were born into. It shaped your nervous system, your expectations, and your first understanding of love, conflict, repair, safety, trust, and even yourself. But it doesn't have to be the final word. What changes people isn't just insight. Although understanding where your patterns came from helps, it's an important first step. But insight alone doesn't change a nervous system. What does change us are new experiences, new relationships, healthier relationships, healthier ways of thinking and responding, and healthier ways of being responded to. Therapy isn't about becoming someone different. It's about creating enough safety that the parts of you that never had room to fully develop finally get a chance to emerge. Earlier, we talked about how healthy parenting doesn't create the authentic self, but it does create the conditions where the authentic self can emerge. Therapy does much the same thing. If you've recognized yourself in today's episode, I hope you'll carry this with you. Your adaptations made sense. They helped you survive. They helped you maintain connection in the only relational system you knew. Your nervous system learned exactly what it needed to learn to fit in. The good news is that development doesn't end in childhood. Through healthy relationships, good therapy, curiosity, accountability, and repair, we can begin building experiences we never had. Healing is gradually uncovering the person who never had enough room to fully emerge. It's learning to trust your perceptions, to recognize your preferences, to know what you feel, to believe that your experience matters, and to become curious about your own inner world. Healing also isn't becoming less caring about other people. It's finally allowing your own inner world to matter just as much. And if you're recognizing your parents somewhere in today's conversation, I hope this doesn't become another reason to stay stuck in anger or spend years trying to diagnose them. Understanding where these adaptations came from isn't about blame. It's about making sense of behaviors that may have confused you for decades. All behavior makes sense. Yours does too. And once something makes sense, it can begin to change. Thanks for spending this time with me today. My hope is that these conversations don't simply help you understand yourself a little better. I hope they also help you become a little more yourself. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.